When speaking about considering taking a role playing a trans man, cis woman Scarlett Johansson once said, "You know, as an actor, I should be allowed to play any person or any tree or any animal because that is my job and the requirements of my job." While I can't speak to Johansson's sense of arboreal entitlement and actually think she might make a decent tree bird one day, the question of whether she, along with other cis actors, should feel so entitled to portraying trans people is somewhat more complex. With studies in the UK and US consistently placing the percentage of trans and non-binary population under 1%, it is likely that a lot of cis people will only ever know trans people via the representations that exist in media, and those representations will shape their attitudes towards us, contributing to an atmosphere of transphobia or acceptance in society.
Oh my God! Einhorn is a man!
It's kind of like if someone found an online profile of yours without you ever having met and started spreading lies about you to other strangers. You might never meet them, but if you do, they'll be convinced you're addicted to shoplifting lip balms from till points and there's nothing you can do about it now. Or, they'll think that as a transgender woman, you're simply a dangerous man in a wig, or as a transgender man, a confused and mentally ill little girl. These harmful and plainly inaccurate stereotypes have real-life ramifications. A 2022 US study found trans people to be 4.5 times more likely than cis people to have a violent crime committed against them. While data also indicates that 82% of transgender individuals have considered killing themselves and 40% have attempted suicide, with suicidality highest among transgender youth. So Robin Williams in Awful Prosthetics, or John Travolta saying Tracy Turnblad,
Tracy Turnblad, don't test me, Tracy Turnblad.
Stop being, were never and aren't funny. Many cisgender people would like to imagine that transphobia and the issue around our representation in media have no effect on their own lives. This is a misconception. No person escapes interaction with the pervasive prescriptiveness of gender roles, the nebulous concepts of masculinity and femininity, and the ostracization often present upon their transgression. As Leslie Feinberg put it, "If you do not identify as transgender, your life is diminished by our oppression as well. Your own choices as a man or a woman are sharply curtailed. Your individual journey to express yourself is shunted into one of two deeply carved ruts, and the social baggage you're handed is already packed." We each stand in some kind of relationship to gender, and the gender roles predetermined for us. A lack of examination of these gender roles and their sovereignty in society signifies a relinquishing of power, the power to mould these roles for ourselves. Therefore, to look to the front line at trans people and learn from these most intensely caught in the crossfire of gender experience can only enrich the lives of cis people too. So does this mean all actors' lived experiences must match exactly the experience of their characters? And couldn't the practice of cis actors studying and empathising with trans people lead to more understanding across the board? Also, isn't the view that trans roles ought to only be played by trans actors a further way to create divisions between people and even animosity if cis actors begin to lose out on roles? The answer is not exactly no, and come on. But let's start by looking at the history of actors and roles of gender other than their own. Ever since quite literally ages ago, cis men have always played cis women in theatre. This was a common practice in ancient Greece, where a lot of the groundwork for modern Western storytelling was laid. Male actors would wear masks to convey that quintessentially female way of making this weird shape with your mouth. The point is, acting was an all-male pursuit, and while I'm sure some performers really did the soul-searching required to make that mouth shape eerily close to how a woman would, it isn't the quality of their performance we're interested in right now, but the political reasons behind it. Ancient Greek society considered women to be inferior citizens and denied them access to acting on those grounds entirely. The Elvis and Michael Jackson of philosophy, Socrates and Plato even worried about the damage these cross-gender performances might inflict on the men's psyche, considering them degrading. It wasn't then, out of a deep desire to explore and understand the plight of underrepresented groups, that cross-gender acting began. It was directly tied to the subjugation of women and harsh inequalities in ancient society. Now it's over 1,000 years later, and there's this new kid on the block who's got a knack for playwriting. He's called Shakespeare, and he keeps writing women into his plays, which is annoying because women are still not allowed to perform on stage. Once again, drag comes to the rescue, and we have men filling in for female actors. This is especially convoluted in cases where the role is that of a woman disguised as a man, as played by a man. Similarly to ancient Greece, Shakespearean cross-gender performance originated as a byproduct of gender inequality, and we can observe a similar state of affairs in Japan. Kabuki theatre began as a female-only art form in the early 17th century until it was banned for being too erotic. Interestingly, this only seemed to be an issue as long as women were involved, and Kabuki subsequently grew into a tradition with male performers cast in all roles. In this way, cross-gender acting was only acceptable so long as the gender of the actor was the one societally dominant, i.e. male. I bring all this up because the history of actors playing characters with genders other than their own is rooted in oppression, and this history is highly relevant to the discussion over whether cis actors should get to embody trans people on stage and screen. The reality of worldwide gender inequality makes cross-gender acting inherently political, with, potentially, an actor from the position of the oppressor cosplaying as the oppressed. It follows then that the blatant and many inequalities between cis and trans people also impose a politicised dynamic onto cis and trans people playing each other in drama, and Scarlett Johansson's view of acting is at best utopian and at worst highly ignorant of the inevitable context in which her work is being made. My take on whether cis and trans people should get to play each other is essentially that it ought to depend on the direction of power. Kind of like the idea of punching up or punching down in comedy. If the actor occupies a more privileged and powerful position in society than the role they are considering, this should give them pause. A marginalised group's portrayal of the dominant group is unlikely to do any damage to that dominant group's daily reality. However, the dominant group's portrayal of the marginalised group have every likelihood of not only influencing but defining public perception, and ultimately even legislation about the rights of the marginalised group. It will shock none of you when I say that the history of trans representation in media has been consistently horrendous, and so the cis actors accepting a trans role isn't the best company. We have some of these films to thank for creating and perpetuating some of the worst trans stereotypes, as well as inculcating a generous dose of internalised transphobia in trans people, and who as a result may not be able to shake the gut-wrenching thought that these representations are how they will inevitably be perceived by the people around them. Not only that, but as we will see it, Hollywood loves a trans tragedy. How are especially young trans people meant to feel any hope about their future when these films tell us that a trans life is one inseparable from violence, pain, and unimaginable adversity? It's also interesting to consider the reason behind the fact that in the vast majority of cases where a cis actor lands a trans role, the gender of the cis actor aligns with the gender the trans character was assigned at birth. Plainly, it's cis men playing trans women and cis women playing trans men. Trans representation is rife with early transition stories. Admittedly, the process of medical transitioning is inherently quite fascinating, although from personal experience I would say that if you spend hours upon hours watching transition experience vlogs and still consider yourself cis, maybe think again. However, one can't help but feel that film's obsession with this process has more to do with a desperate attachment to the status quo than far-reaching empathy. The cis filmmaker is asking the question, can gender really be changed? Is it true that gender isn't fixed? Could the world as we know it be different? And by extension, have these societal dogmas I've tethered myself to been false all along? Then they answer their own question with the devastation of trans tragedy flick. No, of course not. You can try to change, but it will be painful, violent, and ultimately unsuccessful, insofar as being happy or staying alive. And so the cis audience can have its voyeuristic fun and still leave the cinema comfortably unchallenged. Tom Hooper's The Danish Girl neatly encapsulates a lot of these points. Eddie Redmayne taps into a femininity that is at times quite captivating to watch, but ultimately he is still a cis man, Eddie Redmayne playing a trans woman. His character and real person Lee Elby's public and private moments of gender questioning and euphoria feel like exactly what a cis person's idea of those moments might be. possibly due to their research consisting of cross-dressing erotica. There's the 14 different scenes containing stockings, Lily's historically inaccurate assertion that her vision of womanhood excludes her artistic practice in favour of a retail job and gossiping with her girlfriends, and her narratively neat tragic death. All of these elements emphasise the flatness with which Lily is depicted, especially in contrast to Alicia Vikander's character of cis-woman Gerda Wegner, a performance which exists in a much more believable realm. While promo for the Danish Girl tried to spin it as a progressive piece of media, it perpetuates most of every trans stereotype in the book with impressive diligence. The real-life consequences of these stereotypes are palpable, dangerous, and not something cis actors should take lightly. As Jen Richards puts it in the brilliant documentary Disclosure, having cis men play trans women is a direct link to the violence against trans women. Part of the reason that men end up killing trans women is out of the fear that other men will think that they're gay for having been with trans women. The men whose judgment they fear only know trans women from media, and the people who are playing trans women are the men that they know. This doesn't happen when a trans woman plays a trans woman. When you see these women off screen still as women, it completely deflates this idea that they're somehow men in disguise. Okay, but what about cis actors in trans roles where the genders are correctly matched, so to speak? Casting, say a cis man as a trans man, would threaten two things: the actor's own perception of their gender identity, and more importantly, audiences being exposed to the idea that the difference between these two groups is much less significant than they would like to imagine. However, if these concerns were to be overcome, there would be much more potential value in a cis actors taking on these types of trans roles, both in bolstering the message that trans women are women and trans men are men, and in chipping away at the ugly narrative that blurs the line between trans lives and cross-dressing. Past examples that fall into this category still suffer from the stark lack of trans involvement behind the camera, however, making the roles themselves lack nuance. While I believe the argument of actors needing to consider the direction of power still stands, I consider cases where cis actors play trans roles that match their gender to be the most defensible situation, insofar as there is thorough trans representation in the project otherwise. A final argument to consider is that it might be okay to rely on the box office draw of A-list cis actors in order to get trans stories seen by audiences in the first place. As I have shown, the trans actors currently attracting audiences in this way are doing outright damage to trans people. Trans representation doesn't need to mean an all-trans cast. Why not cast a cis A-lister in the supporting role? It worked for previously unknown filmmakers Matt Damon and Ben Affleck in Good Will Hunting when casting Robin Williams. What's more, how will we ever get trans actors on the so-called A-list if we are not casting them in Hollywood films, even to tell their own stories? Scarlett Johansson has subsequently clarified that her quote was taken out of context. Oops, sorry. And she in fact meant that quote in an ideal world, any actor should be able to play anybody. Perhaps we can have a different discussion when we get to this ideal world, the position in which one is thinking about this issue using phrases such as in theory and in an ideal world is a dead giveaway of the privileged side they represent. Cis actors need to give consideration to whether they're punching down and taking on trans roles if they ought to at all. To end with another quote, Hollywood is already made for cisgender actors. It's never not been about them. Until transgender actors are remotely close to being on the playing field, there is no discussion to be had about what actors should or shouldn't be able to do. Trans people's involvement in stories about them should take top priority, always trumping cis actors' rights to play anybody. And if we do that, maybe we can get to Johansson's utopia sooner rather than later. This piece was written by Penn, bálint, a UK-based Hungarian creative making work with the Yoko Situation, an art collective centering trans and disabled voices. It was narrated by Yasmin Gooch, who is a poet and theatre maker.